Hello everyone, it is Matt here from Scoop in Response, and today we're doing something a bit different. We're going to be playing a modern league on Modo. It's a new brew of mine that I've put together. It's a little bit different to what you'd normally see on the channel. Today we're going to be playing a Bant CoCo list using the new card, which is Errant and Giada. It's a really sweet card. I think there's a lot of potential for multiple formats with this one. So Errant Giada is a 3-drop that has, it's got flying, it's a 2/3, and when you can cast creatures with flash or flying off the top of your library, and you can look at your cards at the top of your library at any time. So the thought process around this is when we look at a list like Spirits, Bant Spirits, something like that, there's a lot of cards that I guess individually don't really do that well, but within the collection of the spirits, you know, all of the synergy that they bring to the deck, it's, you know, pretty good. The best, I think, in the whole deck though is Spell Queller, and so what I really like about this list over a standard Bant Spirits list is that the individual card quality is significantly higher, and we're not extremely dependent on drawing our CoCos specifically. So we've got lots of, I guess, good cards that are threats that are going to be able to, you know, give us an edge or an advantage. And even our like less useful cards, for the most part, you know, have additional utility. So with Errant and Giada, for example, we can cast our Birds of Paradise off the top of our library in our main phase so that we're not going to be drawing them each turn. This is the main reason that we've included it over the Noble Hierarchs, which have obviously the Exalted trigger, which is really useful. I think you could probably make an argument for either of them, but you know, for this league we went with the Birds purely for the ability to cast them off the top of the deck. So I think that, I guess, Errant and Giada form, I guess, copy number 5 to 7 of CoCo in this list, in that, you know, we're going to use it to generate advantage. But if you look at all of our 2-drops, with the exception of Lion Sash, you know, they're going to be giving us card advantage as well. You know, our Icefang Coddles, our Stoneforge Mystics, all of those things are, you know, going to be giving us card advantage, whether it's tutoring for a artifact or if it's, you know, just drawing a card. So that's pretty much the, I guess, the idea behind the deck. Whether or not this kind of list is better than the established, you know, decks of this archetype remain to be seen. But I think it's an interesting idea to explore, and that's really the primary purpose of this particular, I guess, video. The sideboard that we've got, it's Containment Priest, Cathar Commando, Dress Down, Subtlety, and 2 Wandering Emperors, with a 1 of Emrakul in case we run into some mill. So I guess you'll notice that the vast majority of the deck is all instant speed. So we're going to be playing lots of things at flash speed. You know, you've got your Endurances, you've got your Brazen Borrowers, your Aven Mind Sensors, and your Spell Quellers, all in your 3-drops. They're all really good. The Aven Mind Sensor is kind of like a really powerful game 1 play. You do lose a bit of equity in game 2 or after they've seen the first one, and there's going to be some matchups where it's like an easy side out with your mind sensors. But overall, I think that it's really useful being able to do that on the play or the draw on turn 2 with a bird. So that's the reason for the include, but it's also got flying and flash, so, you know, we can always get over the top of people with them too. So yeah, we're going to jump into the league now. If you like this kind of content, please let me know. It's kind of a first thing for the channel, you know, putting this kind of content out for Modern and, you know, for MTGO gameplay. So yeah, thanks for checking it out, and I'll see you at the end. Round 1, we're up against Murktide, which is my go-to deck for any larger field tournament. We keep a hand of 7 with 3 lands and turns 1, 2, and 3 plays. It seems like a great start to the league. We lead with the Birds of Paradise and pass to our opponent. Our opponent does the Christian thing and bolts the bird. We can't fault him for that play. Our turn 2, we deploy Stoneforge Mystic. This is our first real decision point. Sword of Fire and Ice would obviously be a great card versus a red-blue deck, but given our opponent has bolted the bird, we have a reasonable chance that they're out of removal. Choosing the Cauldron Complete here is making them have the removal or lose the game. Unfortunately, Unfortunately for us, they do have the second removal spell, but at least we've managed to block any developing plays that put the deck ahead, like a Ledger Shredder plus Bauble. On turn 3, we hold up for even Mind Sensor, but sadly our opponent has Spy Bluff and not a fetch land. Our opponent passes back and we flash in the bird before we untap. We develop our Birds of Paradise and get in for some chip damage. Our opponent plays Ledger Shredder, which is actually a problematic blocker for us, and has the Bauble to trigger Connive. After a bit of a tank, we decide to bounce the Shredder with our Borrower at the end step. We play out Endurance at sorcery speed as our opponent hasn't shown us a counterspell yet, and we want to limit the number of draws they have to find one. Mostly this play is about preventing them casting a Murktide with Delve, which is something that you can't meaningfully respond to in their main phase if the Murktide goes on the stack. Our opponent redeploys their Shredder and a DRC, and we respond in their end step with the Borrower. Strangely, we're kind of lucky drawing our 6th land here so that we can attempt to hard cast the Cauldron Complete, but that counterspell we spoke about before gobbles up the Cauldron Complete and we feel a bit deflated. The Ledger Shredder proves to be problematic, giving us no real profitable attacks. Expressive Iteration comes down from our opponent, and this is where the game really starts to get away from us. We top deck an Endurance, which gets eaten by another counterspell. It's a bit of a disaster. From here, our opponent continues to deploy threats and remove ours. We manage to find back-to-back Borrowers to bounce their Murktide twice, but this isn't enough to keep us in the game. With our opponent on 12 life, we can't quite find enough damage on a crackback at any point. We're somewhat unlucky not finding a CoCo or a Giada to help us get back to card parity, and our opponent certainly had a great hand texture to deal with our threats at each point in the game. For sideboarding, we took out 3 Evan Mind Sensors for 2 Subtlety and a Wandering Emperor. With any CoCo deck, we want to make sure that we always have a density of CoCo hits, so even though we cut 3 of them and didn't bring any more in, we still have 28 hits or an 86.9% chance to find 2 targets from a CoCo. Granted, we're running 3 copies of a legendary creature, so it may work out to be very slightly less than this number, given that we're able to find more than 1 copy of Giada in a CoCo. You can use a Hypergeometric Calculator to work out the odds for things like this. I used the one hosted by Aether Hub. The link is in the description. We keep a pretty great 6 and lead on a tapped land. Our opponent baubles himself and passes back. We run out of Stoneforge, and given that we've seen our opponent bauble themselves and play a basic island, we decide to try for the Cauldron line again after a considerable tank. Our opponent shocks in Steam Vents and dashes a Ragavan. There isn't really a world where we want to block here, given the threat of Cauldron leaves them just about dead to Borrower or Aether Spellbomb. Sadly, our opponent has an Unholy Heat for our Stoneforge. We find our 3rd land off the top, never didn't have it, and play Birds of Paradise, realizing our mana won't allow for flashing in of the Ice Fang a little bit too late. On reflection, this misplay is a pretty big deal, as even sorcery speeding the Ice Fang might have given us a green mana source. Our opponent dashes Ragavan and exiles a basic island, so our minor misplay doesn't give us the rub we probably deserve. We draw Sophie and go to end step. Our opponent fetches, leaving only 1 mana up, and this is the window for us to cast CoCo. We're limiting the number of counters that they can have to Spell Pierce, or if it was really weird, a Force of Negation. I didn't really see either of those being likely, as we basically resolved creatures exclusively in game 1. Our CoCo resolves, and we find Birds of Paradise and Stoneforge Mystic, as well as getting rid of a bunch of lands off the top. We choose Lion's Sash as our equipment, and our opponent finishes our turn with a Consider. Our opponent untaps and Disaster strikes as they evoke Fury, pitching Ragavan, dealing with all 3 of our creatures nice and neatly. This turn hurt so badly, and it was just as bad watching it the second time as I was putting the video together. The punishment isn't over though. Our opponent casts a Blood Moon and then a Ragavan and Dragon Rage Channeler. We take a draw step and concede the match to our opponent. For round 2, we win the die roll and keep a 7 with a bird opener on turn 1. Our opponent plays a land and a Hardened Scales, which is a card usually played in a deck called Hardened Scales. Turn 2, we decide that instead of having a good play like a Spell Queller, we'd rather play a land tapped for no reason and have to play a Lion's Sash instead. Feeling silly, we pass back the turn. Our opponent plays Inkmoth and then the Ozolith and a Sabaz. Thankfully, it's a very slow start for them, but I've punted enough games versus this deck to know that it can crush your dreams in an instant. Turn 3, we untap and play our fetch land. Because we can put a second fetch land into the bin, we're actually able to attack profitably with the Lion's Sash, as we can threaten to eat 2 permanents if they block with Zabaz. Our opponent doesn't fall for the trick, and we pass the turn. They deploy a Welding Jar and then an Arcbound Ravager, which we snap Spell Queller to exile. They pass it back to us, and we draw a Borrower for turn. We put the attacks in with our creatures and pass back to our opponent. Our opponent untaps and casts a Hangerback Walker, which we think looks nice under the second Spell Queller in our hand. They ship it back to us, and we forget to use our bird to eat one of the lands in our graveyard. We draw an island and continue the beatdown. With the flexibility of Endurance, Borrower, and Ice Fang in our hand, we have a lot of ways to stop our opponents from doing things we don't want them to do, so attacking feels quite safe here. They untap and cast their second Zabaz, which dies to the Legend Rule, triggering the Ozolith and getting additional counters from Scales, all of which move on to Zabaz, putting it to 9 power at the beginning of combat. They deploy a Hangerback Walker in their second main, which we respond to by bouncing Zabaz. The counters will still go on the Ozolith, but they won't be added to the Hangerback Walker as well. This time we make sure to eat a land and cast our Ice Fang, giving us Xaxes with any fetch land, which we skillfully draw off the top. Our sideboard plan for this matchup is really simple. We cut 4 Aven Mind Sensor and a Lion Sash for 3 Cathar Commando and 2 Wandering Emperor. Our 7 is perfectly reasonable, but we have to do better as Scales can kill us very quickly even with an average hand. Our 6 is much better despite having 4 lands. They open up with Hardened Scales turn 1 and ship it back to us. We draw a Borrower for turn and play our fetch, passing back. They Stirrings, finding a Misty Rainforest and play the Ozolith. We fetch at end step for a Snow-Covered Island, and in a strange turn of events, we choose to play another fetch and find a Shock, giving ourselves 2 less life unnecessarily. We wanted to make sure that we're below 18 life in case they happen to have a transformational sideboard into Scapeshift, and in which case they deserve the win. We play Stoneforge Mystic and go and find the All-Star Game winner from round 1, Cauldron Complete. Our opponent untaps and plays the Buzz plus... Our opponent untaps and plays the Baz plus... Our opponent untaps and plays... Our opponent untaps and plays the Baz plus Springleaf Drum. They drop an Arcbound Worker for good measure. We untap and play our land, passing back. They untap and cast the Ozolith, the Shattered Spire, which is a new card from March of the Machine. It's more expensive to cast than Scales or Ozolith, but it kind of does both of those cards' jobs. They attack, to which we respond by flashing in Cauldron. We decide to block the Zabaz, which kills it, putting a bunch of triggers onto the stack in a rare example where first strike is actually less favourable for us. We take 6 damage and they ship it back to us. We untap and draw Cathar Commando for turn, which, weird as it is not our best play this turn. We play our 4th land and decide to first bounce Arcbound Worker and then the Ozolith, making all of those counters go away for good. Our opponent has suffered enough and scoops it up. Round 3, we lose the play but keep a reasonable 6. Our opponent leads with a tap land pass on a keep of 7. We decide to play our recently drawn Shadow Spear off an untapped Breeding Pool turn 1. Our opponent plays a Windswept Heath and passes back. We draw Errant and Giada for turn, play a Seachrome Coast and cast Stoneforge Mystic, finding Cauldron Complete. We ship it back and our opponent fetches a Trio. Turn 3, our opponent plays a Flooded Strand, fetching a Breeding Pool to cast an Eternal Witness, returning the Flooded Strand to hand. We play a Seachrome Coast and activate Stoneforge, bringing in Cauldron and attacking them down to 11. They fetch a basic Plains and cast Omnath. We untap, play a tapped Seachrome Coast and equip Shadow Spear. We attack and our opponent goes to 4. Our opponent untaps and plays a fetch land, finding a Hallowed Fountain with Windswept Heath, triggering Omnath twice. They go to 7 life and use their floating mana to cast a Prismatic Ending, targeting our Germ token, before deploying Elesh Norn and attacking with the Omnath. We draw Aven Mind Sensor, play a Flooded Strand and pass the turn. Our opponent plays a fetch land, triggering all 3 modes with Omnath thanks to Elesh Norn. We then cast CoCo in their end step, revealing a very medium Borrower and Ice Fang. They Solitude us, taking out 2 of our creatures, and we decide to scoop it up there. Unfortunately, the next game has the same result, with our opponent significantly outvaluing us with their elementals. We had a pretty reasonable curve, which was blown out by a Fury and Teferi bounces. Our CoCo on turn 4 was at sorcery speed due to Teferi, followed up by a Solitude and Ephemerate to get our concession. Round 4, we lose the flip but keep a fantastic 7 with 4 lands, CoCo, Giada, and Birds of Paradise. Our opponent leads on Stomping Ground tapped and we deploy our Temple Garden and Birds of Paradise after drawing Spell Queller. Our opponent plays a Misty and passes back. We draw another Birds and play Island for turn and pass back to our opponent, who fetches at end step for a tapped Steam Vents. They play Misty Rainforest and pass. At their end step, we get to play Errant and Giada for the first time in the league where it's actually relevant. We see we're drawing CoCo with the Stoneforge on top, so we send some Errant and Giada beat after playing Castle Ardenvale and shipping it back. Our opponent fetches a Hallowed Fountain at end step. They untap and play a Gemstone Mine, passing back to us. We CoCo at the end step, but skillfully we choose to remove a Force of Negation from our opponent's hand instead of finding 2 creatures. We untap and draw the Stoneforge, play our land and a bird before getting in with more Giada beats. Giada and Errant reveals a Spell Queller on top of the deck, which will definitely come in handy in our opponent's next turn. Our opponent untaps and casts a Shardless Agent, cascading into Glimpse of Tomorrow. We respond with CoCo, putting Borrower and Spell Queller into play, exiling their Glimpse, and leaving them with a very sad Shardless Agent. We untap and draw Prismatic Vista, revealing a Stoneforge on the top of our deck. We decide to play the land and fetch for the shuffle effect in the hope of finding another flash creature on top. Fetching puts another land on top, so we cast the Stoneforge in our hand, searching up a Sophie and getting another shuffle. The last shuffle reveals a Spell Queller, so we're happy with that. We get in for flying beats with the team and pass to our opponent. Our opponent scoops it up in the main phase and we move on to game 2. For our sideboarding, we decide to cut 3 Endurances for 3 Containment Priests. It's worth noting that there is some anti-synergy with the Containment Priest and CoCo. You'll find to put a Containment Priest into play with CoCo, but you won't want to cast any CoCos while you have a Containment Priest on the field. This card is specifically for Glimpse, Living End, and Creativity, helping us shore up those matchups, and it further supports our Spell Quellers, which are already reasonable as a disruption tool for those decks. Game 2, we keep a reasonably slow 6, being able to cast a CoCo on turn 3 seems pretty good though. The keep is fair but not great, and really only for this kind of matchup where it's quite difficult for the Glimpse player to resolve a game-winning Glimpse on turn 3. It can happen, but it's very unlikely when the volume of permanents is so low. Our opponent opens with a tapped Fountain, we play our birds on turn 1 after drawing an Aven Mind Sensor, and our opponent plays a Misty Rainforest and passes back to us again. We untap and play Seachrome Coast with the prospect of getting our opponent's good. They fetch at end step and we respond with the Mind Sensor. Unfortunately, they find a Steam Vents and we feel a bit sad on the inside. They deploy Gemstone Caverns as land 3, meaning that they're unable to cast any Cascade spells other than Ardent Plea, which we haven't seen yet in their deck. They pass back to us, which means we're in the clear, and we untap and play a land and bird for turn, getting in beats and passing back. Our opponent plays a Tarn, this time failing to find, as we end step CoCo, and they hard cast a Force and Negation in response. We untap and draw Cauldron Complete, which is strangely castable on turn 5 thanks to our 5 lands and 2 birds. We get in for beats, and our opponent takes a draw step before they scoop it. Round 5, we lose the flip and keep a reasonable 7 against our opponent's 6. Our opponent plays a Triome turn 1 and passes. We play a land and birds, shipping it back. Turn 2, our opponent plays Hall of Storm Giants and Prismatic Ending the bird. We deploy a land and Stoneforge, fetching Cauldron. Turn 3, our opponent plays a Hallowed Fountain, casts a Fairy, bouncing the Stoneforge. We untap, play a land and cast Aven Mind Sensor in the hopes that we're able to lock them out from further fetches. They untap and play a second Teferi, fetching a Zagoth Triome off a Scalding Tarn. Turn 4, we play a land and try the same thing again, and our opponent does the same thing right back at us, fetching an island with a Flooded Strand. We untap and play a land for turn and then play Birds of Paradise and Stoneforge Mystic. The Aven Mind Sensor has lost most of its value at this point, with our opponent on 5 lands, and our opponent casts a Dress Down in response to the Stoneforge. We don't mind though, as we already have 2 targets in hand. We pass back and our opponent puts a Chalice on 1, which really only stops us casting more birds. They play a Leyline Binding targeting the Stoneforge, and with 5 lands we decide to play Sophie and an Aven Mind Sensor, making it impossible for our opponent to prevent an attack with just 1 piece of removal next turn. We untap and equip our bird with Sophie, sending them at Tef. Our opponent casts Prismatic Ending, removing the Sophie, and our bird bounces off the Planeswalker, doing nothing. We deploy Stoneforge number 2, with them responding again with a Dress Down. We're definitely trying, hopefully we'll run them out of removal soon. We ship it to them and they play their 7th land, turning on the Hall of Storm Giants. They pass back to us, we untap and draw a Castle Ardenvale. We waste no time activating the Stoneforge, finally putting the Cauldron Complete into play. We play our land and move to combat. Our opponent charms the Germ at the beginning of combat, which is absolutely fine, as we're able to still kill the Tef with our Aven Mind Sensor. We petty theft the Germ token and send it over to our opponent. Our opponent untaps and passes back, with us flashing in our Brazen Borrower from an adventure. They respond with Memory Deluge, and Sunday Lunch continues. We move to our turn and draw, equipping Stoneforge with Cauldron. Our opponent hardcasts Solitude, targeting the Stoneforge. We still haven't got to attack with our Cauldron, so we get in for attacks with the Aven Mind Sensor and Brazen Borrower. Our opponent untaps and sends in the Solitude, gaining 3 life in the process. They cast a Supreme Verdict, buy their Kahira from the Companion Zone, and ship it back to us. We untap and draw Lion's Sash. We play the Sash main phase and pass to them. They then untap and flash back Memory Deluge. We respond with CoCo, finding Endurance and Spell Queller, putting the spell under the Spirit and shuffling the graveyard to the bottom of the library. We untap and draw Temple Garden, giving us access to our 7th mana again, and we decide this is actually our Cauldron that's unlucky. But also because it won't change the clock to equip our Cauldron, as we have a 2-turn clock if we eat 2 permanents from the graveyard before our next attack. Our opponent untaps and casts removal spell number 107 and exiles our Spell Queller, casting the Memory Deluge underneath it. They pass to us, and in our end step, we start eating up the permanents and flashing in our creatures. They counter our Giada, and we deploy Aven Mind Sensor. We untap, threatening 7 damage, so we eat 1 more permanent to make it lethal. They flash in a Leyline Binding, targeting the Lion's Sash, so we decide to remove the recast of the Deluge on the way out. We get in for 5 damage, taking them to 3. They untap and ship it back to us. We flash in the Ice Fang at the end step, and they decide to scoop it up there. For sideboarding, we add a Subtlety and Wandering Emperor, trimming 2 Aven Mind Sensors. Typically, I don't want to over sideboard as our deck is already doing pretty well and dealing with the game plan. You could make arguments for adding more subtleties, trimming some Stoneforge hits, or even bringing in Cathars to deal with the Leyline Bindings. Ultimately, I felt pretty comfortable with how the deck would play out. Winning this matchup is all about avoiding frustration and making unforced errors, giving them free value. Game 2, we keep a 7 with 5 lands and a Stoneforge and CoCo. It's a slow start. The Stoneforge means they have to deal with the threat in order to prevent Cauldron beats, potentially buying us some turns to set up for a CoCo. They play a Tarn and pass back to us. We draw an Aven Mind Sensor and play Flooded Strand. They fetch Triome in the end step and play an island, passing it back. We untap, play our land, and swap the Stoneforge with their counterspell, which we know is going to get countered 95% of the time. We pass back to them and they continue playing a land and buying Kahira. We untap and draw the Cauldron anyways, so we play a land and pass back to them. They untap and play a Glacial Fortress. We decide it's still worth casting the Mind Sensor and their Memory Deluge in response to our fetch. We untap and play our land for turn, getting in with the bird and holding up CoCo. They untap and Prismatic Ending the Sensor with 2 blue open. At the end step, we decide to play Brazen Borrower and successfully bait the counterspell, preserving our CoCo. With our opponent on 4 cards in hand and tapped out without Teferi, our CoCo is guaranteed to 2-1 in every run out other than a Supreme Verdict next turn. We put Endurance and Lion Sash into play, choosing not to shuffle either graveyard into the deck as we want permanents to eat and can deny the flashback spell well before they have the mana to cast it. We ship it to them and they untap, casting Teferi to bounce our Endurance and casting Kikira. At the end step, we eat their Tarn and move to our turn. We draw an Ice Fang and eat the Deluge from the graveyard. We declare attacks at Teferi with 2 white mana presented as the combat trick. If they decide to block with Kikira, they decide to block anyways, so we eat 2 permanents and kill the cat. They untap and tick up before fetching a Triumph with their Tarn. We realize a bit too late that we can't flash in that Ice Fang that we were holding up, feeling a bit silly. We untap and draw Subtlety, shocking into Breeding Pool and hard casting Cauldron, which remarkably resolves. We get in for beats and our opponent casts Aware on the Cauldron. Either they didn't know that the Cauldron is indestructible or they misclicked on trying to target the Lion Sash. It's pretty unlucky for our opponent. They played a really tight game up until this point. They charm the Germ, which is thankfully tapped already, so they can't block. Teferi dies and we ship it to them. They untap and attack us with the Cauldron, which so far has been used to deal 5 damage to us and 0 damage to our opponent this match, despite being on the battlefield or in hand for more than 20 turns. They pass to us. We untap, drawing a Birds of Paradise. We cast our Ice Fang and get in for 4 with the Lion Sash before passing it back. We use the bird to soak up 1 damage, taking the rest from trample. The logic of this is that we have 4 life instead of 3, which while we have seen a Chalice in their main board and no bolts thus far, I didn't want to risk the game to something as trivial as getting bolted, given that we have the lethal on the crackback. We cast CoCo in their end step and it resolves. We choose an Endurance and a Giada, giving us lethal if our opponent's out of removal. We swing with the team, they Aether Gust our Endurance. We have 7 damage being presented currently, but with plenty of permanents in the bin, we eat 2 and deal lethal to our opponent. So we finished up 3-2 in the league. Overall, I think it's a pretty good result for the sort of first time piloting the deck. It's there's not really a lot that I would change. I'm curious to try the Noble Hierarchs, and I think that I'd be interested to, I guess, mull around how we might find better ways to play against the Elementals and just sort of mid-range value piles. Obviously, we're going to need a lot more in the way of testing to really know where it sits. Errant and Giada didn't really get to do a lot this league, but it did have a few moments where it shone, so really useful there. Thanks so much for checking out this video, and if you're still with us, yeah, really appreciate it. Don't forget to eat your vegetables, like and subscribe, and do all of that, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now.